The twin moons of Kethvar cast their silver light across the hunting grounds, illuminating the sacred circle where young Velthar crouched in wait. His spotted fur bristled with anticipation as he gripped the ceremonial blade his father had given him just hours before. Tonight, he would complete the rite of ascension and finally earn his place among the adult hunters of the Kethvari pride. The rules were simple, carved into stone tablets that had stood for over 3,000 cycles. To become a true hunter, a young Kethvari must kill a sentient being with their own claws or blade. No weapons beyond the traditional ones. No help from others. Just predator and prey as their ancestors had done since the dawn of their civilization. Velthar's ears twitched as he heard movement in the undergrowth. His enhanced hearing picked up the sound of footsteps, clumsy and heavy compared to the silent padding of Kethvari paws. The prey had arrived. The elders had chosen well this time. A human had crashed on their world 3 rotations ago, the sole survivor of what appeared to be a merchant vessel that had suffered engine failure. The human had been captured alive, kept fed and healthy specifically for this moment. Velthar had watched from the shadows as the creature moved about its holding pen, and he had been struck by how similar it looked to the Kethvari in some ways. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head with forward-facing eyes. But where the Kethvari had fur, sharp claws, and powerful haunches built for leaping, this human was soft, pink, and seemingly defenseless. Perfect prey for a coming-of-age hunt. The human stumbled into the moonlit clearing, looking around with obvious fear. It was smaller than Velthar had expected, perhaps barely reaching his shoulder height. The creature's breathing was rapid and shallow, and Velthar could smell its terror from 30 paces away. This would be easier than he had imagined. Velthar studied his prey more carefully as it moved across the clearing. The human was young, he realized. Not a fully grown adult, but something equivalent to his own age among its species. The creature had light brown hair that fell in waves around its shoulders and large eyes that seemed to catch every shadow, searching desperately for escape routes that didn't exist. The hunting ground was a natural depression surrounded by steep walls of smooth rock. The only way out was through a narrow passage that led back to the Kethvari settlement, and that path was blocked by 3 adult hunters who would ensure the human didn't flee. Traditional rules dictated that if the prey somehow escaped the circle, the young hunter would fail the rite and have to wait another full cycle before trying again. But this human wasn't going anywhere. Velthar crept closer, using the ancient stalking techniques his father had drilled into him since he was barely old enough to walk. Move with the shadows. Test each step before committing your weight. Keep the wind in your favor. Become one with the hunt. The human suddenly froze, head tilted as if listening. Velthar remained perfectly still, impressed despite himself. The creature had better senses than most prey species, but it wouldn't matter. The Kethvari had been apex predators for millennia. No soft, clawless creature could hope to match their hunting prowess. Minutes passed in tense silence. The human slowly began moving again, this time toward a cluster of large boulders that offered the illusion of shelter. Velthar smiled, showing his sharp canine teeth. The creature was thinking tactically, trying to put its back against something solid. Smart, but ultimately futile. He decided to end the hunt quickly. Father had always taught him that a clean kill was more honorable than a prolonged chase. Velthar gathered his powerful leg muscles beneath him and prepared to leap. That's when the human did something unexpected. Instead of cowering behind the rocks, the creature began to sing. The sound was unlike anything Velthar had ever heard, not the harsh war cries of conquered enemies or the terrified shrieks of typical prey. This was something soft and melodic, rising and falling like wind through the crystal caves of his home territory. The human's voice carried across the hunting ground with startling clarity, filling the space between the rocky walls. Velthar found himself frozen, not by hunting discipline, but by something he couldn't name. The song had no words he could understand, but somehow it spoke of sadness and hope intertwined, of longing for home and acceptance of fate, of beauty that existed even in the face of death. The young Kethvari shook his head sharply, trying to dispel whatever strange effect the human's voice was having on him. This was foolishness. Prey was prey, regardless of what sounds it made. Many creatures had beautiful voices. That didn't make them less suitable for killing. But as the song continued, Velthar found his grip loosening on the ceremonial blade. Images flashed through his mind, memories he didn't understand. A small human dwelling with warm light spilling from windows. Figures gathered around a table, sharing food and laughter. a sense of belonging and love that felt achingly familiar despite being completely alien. Were these the human's memories somehow reaching him through the song? That was impossible. The Kethvari had no telepathic abilities, and neither did humans according to the information their scouts had gathered. The song ended abruptly as the human noticed Velthar's position. Their eyes met across the moonlit clearing, predator and prey regarding each other with mutual wariness. But instead of the terror Velthar expected to see, the human's face showed something else entirely. Resignation, yes, but also a strange kind of peace. The human slowly reached into the tattered remains of its clothing and withdrew something small and glinting. For a moment, Velthar tensed, thinking it might be a weapon. But as the creature held the object up to catch the moonlight, he realized it was nothing more than a small pendant shaped like a star. The human spoke then, voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the still air. The words were in its own language, incomprehensible to Velthar, but the tone was unmistakable. The creature was saying goodbye to someone who wasn't there. Velthar felt something twist uncomfortably in his chest. This wasn't how the hunt was supposed to go. Prey was supposed to run, to fight, to give him the thrill of the chase and the satisfaction of a hard-won victory. It wasn't supposed to face death with dignity and grace, holding on to memories of love while preparing to die alone on an alien world. The human carefully placed the pendant back inside its clothing, then looked directly at Velthar again. This time, the creature did something that sent shock waves through the young hunter's entire worldview. It smiled, not a grimace of fear or a snarl of defiance, but a gentle, sad smile that somehow conveyed understanding and forgiveness. The human nodded slightly, as if giving Velthar permission to do what he had come here to do. Velthar's hand trembled around the blade's handle. Everything he had been taught, everything he believed about strength and honor and the natural order of things, suddenly felt uncertain. The rite of ascension was meant to prove that he could take a life when necessary, that he had the courage and skill to be a provider and protector for his pride. But what kind of courage did it take to kill someone who wasn't fighting back? What honor was there in ending the life of a being who faced death with more grace than many Kethvari warriors? The young hunter's breathing became rapid and shallow, matching what the humans had been earlier. But where the human had been afraid, Velthar was confused and conflicted. The blade felt impossibly heavy in his grip, and the moonlight seemed to make it glow with an accusatory light. He thought about his father, waiting back at the settlement with the other elders, about the pride and joy that would shine in the old hunter's eyes when Velthar returned with proof of his first kill, about the feast that would be held in his honor, the songs that would be sung of his successful passage into adulthood. Then he looked at the human again, still standing quietly beside the cluster of boulders, waiting. The creature was someone's child, Velthar realized with startling clarity. Somewhere in the vast emptiness of space, there were people who loved this being the way his own parents loved him. People who would never know what had happened, who would spend the rest of their lives wondering and hopping and grieving. Velthar's father had always taught him that true strength meant making the hard choices, doing what needed to be done regardless of personal cost. But suddenly, the young hunter wasn't sure which choice was truly the hard one. Killing this defenseless being who had shown him nothing but dignity and grace would certainly be physically easy. The human had no natural weapons, no fighting skills that could match Kethvari training. One quick strike and it would be over. But letting the human live would mean facing the disappointment and anger of his entire pride. It would mean being labeled a failure, a coward who couldn't complete the most basic requirement of Kethvari adulthood. It might even mean exile, cast out to wander alone until he died or found some other pride willing to take in a hunter who couldn't truly call himself such. The seconds stretched into minutes as predator and prey continued their silent communion across the moonlit clearing. Neither moved, both locked in a moment that would define not just Velthar's future, but his very understanding of what it meant to be Kethvari. Finally, the human broke the silence. It spoke again in its alien tongue, voice soft and questioning. Though Velthar couldn't understand the words, something in the tone made him think the creature was asking if he was all right, as if this being who was about to die was concerned about his emotional state. The irony was so profound, it nearly made Velthar laugh, if he hadn't been on the verge of what felt like a complete spiritual collapse. He thought about the stories the elders told of the great hunters of the past, warriors who had faced down creatures 10 times their size, who had led raids against enemy settlements and returned with victory and honor. Had any of them ever faced this choice? Had any of them ever looked into the eyes of their prey and seen not an enemy to be defeated, but a person to be mourned? The blade slipped from Velthar's nerveless fingers, clattering against the rocky ground with a sound that seemed to echo forever in the confined space of the hunting ground. The human's eyes widened slightly at the noise, but the creature didn't move from its position. Velthar stared at the fallen weapon, his mind reeling. He had just committed an act that went against everything he had been raised to believe. The ceremonial blade was sacred, passed down through generations of his family line. Dropping it was tantamount to surrendering, to admitting defeat before the battle had even truly begun. But as he looked up at the human again, Velthar realized that perhaps this wasn't a battle at all. Perhaps it had never been meant to be won. The human slowly approached, moving with careful, deliberate steps that clearly telegraphed its intentions. It wasn't trying to escape or attack. Instead, it knelt down beside the fallen blade and gently picked it up, examining the intricate carvings along its edge with obvious appreciation for the craftsmanship. Then, in a gesture that would haunt Velthar for the rest of his life, the human carefully placed the blade on a flat rock between them and stepped back, not offering it as a weapon to be used, but returning it with the respect due a sacred object. That simple act of dignity and honor, performed by a being that every law and tradition of Kethvari society said was nothing more than prey, shattered the last of Velthar's resolve. The young hunter sank to his knees, overwhelmed by emotions he had no words to describe. Everything he had thought he knew about strength, honor, and the natural order of the universe had been turned upside down by one small human who sang in the face of death and showed kindness to the one meant to kill them. When he finally looked up, the human was gone. Velthar spun around frantically, searching the hunting ground for any sign of where the human had gone. The rocky walls rose smooth and unclimbable on all sides, and the single exit was still blocked by the elder hunters. There was nowhere the creature could have disappeared to, yet somehow it had vanished as silently as morning mist. A low growl from the passage entrance made Velthar's blood run cold. His father, Krethvar, emerged from the shadows with the other elders flanking him. The old hunter's amber eyes scanned the empty clearing before settling on his son, who still knelt beside the rock where the human had placed the ceremonial blade. "Where is the prey?" Krethvar's voice carried the dangerous quiet that Velthar had learned to fear as a cub. It was the tone that preceded swift and terrible punishment. Velthar's throat felt dry as sand. It escaped. The lie came easily, born of desperation and a protective instinct he didn't fully understand. He couldn't bring himself to admit what had really happened, couldn't find words to explain how a simple human had unmade everything he thought he knew about honor and strength. Krethvar's eyes narrowed as he approached his son. The other elders spread out, their own weapons gleaming in the moonlight as they began searching the hunting ground for any trace of where the human might have gone. "Escaped how?" Krethvar's claws extended slightly, scoring marks in the stone as he stopped just arm's length from Velthar. "You were positioned perfectly. The creature had no weapons, no knowledge of our terrain. How does prey simply vanish from a sealed hunting ground?" Velthar forced himself to meet his father's gaze, even as his heart hammered against his ribs. "It was cleverer than we thought, found some crevice in the rocks that we missed." The words tasted like ash in his mouth, but he pressed on. "By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late to follow." One of the other elders, a scarred veteran named Sekthan, approached from the far side of the clearing. "There are no tracks," he reported, his voice puzzled. "No scent trail leading anywhere except in circles around this central area. It's as if the creature simply disappeared." Krethvar's growl deepened and the sound sent ice through Velthar's veins. "Show me exactly what happened," his father commanded. "Every detail, where you were positioned, where the prey moved, everything." For the next hour, Velthar endured the most terrifying performance of his life. He walked the elders through a fabricated version of events, describing how he had stalked the human perfectly only to have it somehow slip away at the crucial moment. He pointed to imaginary hiding spots, suggested possible escape routes that didn't exist, and watched his father's expression grow darker with each passing moment. The worst part was how easily the physical evidence supported his story. The human truly was gone, vanished without a trace in a way that defied explanation. The elders found no signs of struggle, no blood, no indication that a hunt had even taken place. Just an empty clearing and a young hunter who had somehow failed the most basic task of his people. "This is unprecedented," Sekthan murmured to another elder as they concluded their search. "In 3,000 cycles, no prey has ever escaped from the sacred hunting ground. The walls are unclimbable, the exit was guarded, and Yet my son has managed to lose the most defenseless prey we have ever provided for a Rite," Krethvar finished, his voice heavy with disgust. "A soft, clawless creature that should have been no more challenging than hunting a sick herbivore." Velthar flinched at the venom in his father's words, but forced himself to remain silent. Anything he said now would only make things worse. The elders spent another hour examining every inch of the hunting ground, searching for some explanation for what had happened. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. The human had vanished as completely as if it had never existed at all. Finally, as the twin moons reached their zenith, Krethvar called an end to the search. The hunters gathered in the center of the clearing, their faces grim in the silver light. "The Rite has failed," Krethvar announced, his words falling like hammer blows. "For the first time in our recorded history, prey has escaped from the sacred ground during a coming-of-age hunt. This is a mark of shame that will stain our pride for generations." Velthar wanted to protest, to point out that the human's disappearance was hardly his fault if it had truly been that clever. But he couldn't speak without revealing the truth, and the truth was a burden he wasn't ready to share. "What does this mean?" asked Yethrin, the youngest of the elders. "What happens to Velthar now?" Krethvar's amber eyes fixed on his son with an expression colder than the space between stars. "He will have another chance as tradition demands, but not for a full cycle. And when the time comes, his prey will be selected from among the most dangerous creatures we can capture. If he cannot prove himself against proper adversaries, then perhaps he is not meant to be Kethvari at all." The implications of those words hit Velthar like a physical blow. His father wasn't just talking about a more difficult hunt. He was suggesting that failure might result in exile or death, the ultimate shame for any member of their species. The elders dispersed back toward the settlement, their disappointed mutters echoing off the rocky walls. Krethvar lingered, studying his son with an expression that mixed anger, confusion, and something that might have been grief. "I do not understand what happened here tonight," the old hunter said finally. "But I know my son, and I know when he is keeping secrets. Whatever the truth is, Velthar, it had better be worth the price you will pay for it." With that ominous warning, Krethvar stalked away, leaving Velthar alone in the moonlit clearing with nothing but his thoughts and the weight of his choices. The young hunter sank down beside the rock where the human had placed his blade, picking up the sacred weapon with trembling hands. The metal was still warm, as if the human's touch had somehow transferred heat that lingered despite the cool night air. What had he done? In a moment of what felt like clarity, he had made a choice that went against everything he had been raised to believe. But now, in the aftermath, Velthar wasn't sure whether he had acted out of wisdom or cowardice. Had he shown true strength by refusing to kill a defenseless being, or had he simply failed to do what was necessary? The questions plagued him as he made his way back to the settlement. The other young hunters his age looked at him with mixtures of pity and contempt as word of his failure spread. Some whispered that he was cursed, that the spirits of their ancestors had withdrawn their favor from him. Others suggested more pragmatic explanations, that perhaps Velthar was simply not meant to be a hunter at all. His mother, Yalara, tried to comfort him when he returned to their dwelling. She brought him his favorite foods and spoke soothingly about how everyone faced setbacks, how this was merely a delay rather than a true defeat. But even her gentle words couldn't ease the turmoil in Velthar's heart. The worst part was the uncertainty. Had the human truly escaped, vanishing through some miracle of cleverness or luck? Or had something else happened in those final moments when Velthar had been overwhelmed by emotion and confusion? He replayed the events over and over in his mind, searching for some explanation that made sense. The human had been there, standing peacefully beside the boulders. Then Velthar had dropped the blade, lost in the implications of what he was being asked to do. The human had retrieved the weapon and placed it respectfully on the rock. And then nothing. One moment the creature had been there, the next it was gone. No sound of movement, no flash of motion in his peripheral vision, just absence where presence had been. Had he somehow lost consciousness for a moment? Had the stress and emotion of the situation caused him to black out, giving the human time to find some escape route that he had missed? It was possible, but it didn't feel right. His memories were clear and continuous right up until the moment the human vanished. As the days passed, Velthar found himself struggling to concentrate on his normal activities. His hunting skills, once sharp and instinctive, became clumsy and uncertain. During training sessions with the other young hunters, he missed obvious opportunities and made basic mistakes that drew mockery from his peers. The elders watched him with growing concern and disapproval. Some began to whisper that perhaps his failure at the Rite had revealed a fundamental weakness in his character, a lack of the killer instinct that defined true Kethvari hunters. Velthar himself began to wonder if they were right. The very thought of taking a life now filled him with a strange revulsion that he couldn't explain. When he looked at potential prey during training hunts, he found himself seeing individuals rather than targets. Creatures with their own hopes and fears, their own reasons for wanting to live. This was dangerous thinking for a Kethvari. Their entire society was built on the understanding that the strong had the right to take from the weak, that predators were naturally superior to prey. To question that fundamental truth was to question the very foundation of their civilization. But Velthar couldn't stop the questions from coming. Why was it honorable to kill a defenseless being? What made the Kethvari so much more deserving of life than the creatures they hunted? Were strength and hunting prowess really the only measures of worth in the universe? These thoughts isolated him from his peers more than his failed Rite ever could. The other young hunters sensed something different about him, something that made them uncomfortable. They began to avoid him during meals and social gatherings, as if his failure might be contagious. His father watched this decline with growing anger and disappointment. Krethvar had been one of the most renowned hunters of his generation, famous for taking down prey twice the size of normal Kethvari targets. To see his son struggling with such basic concepts of predator superiority was a source of deep shame. "You are thinking too much," Krethvar told him one evening as they shared a meal in tense silence. "Hunting is not about philosophy or emotion. It is about survival, about maintaining the natural order that has kept our people strong for millennia." "But why does the natural order require killing?" Velthar asked, immediately regretting the words as his father's expression darkened. "Because without death there is no meaning to life," Krethvar growled. "Without struggle there is no growth. The prey we hunt serves a purpose by testing our skills and feeding our bodies. Their deaths have meaning because they contribute to our strength." "But what if they don't want to contribute?" The question slipped out before Velthar could stop it. "What if they have their own purposes, their own meaning that doesn't involve being prey?" Krethvar stared at his son in shock, as if Velthar had suddenly begun speaking in an alien tongue. "That is not how the world works," he said finally. "Prey exists to be hunted. That is their function in the great cycle of existence. To suggest otherwise is madness." But even as his father spoke those words with absolute certainty, Velthar found himself remembering the human song, the melody that had spoken of beauty and loss, of connections that transcended the simple relationship between predator and prey. In that moment, the human had not seemed like a creature existing solely to serve Kethvari purposes. It had seemed like a complete being with its own inner life, its own reasons for valuing existence. The memory of that song haunted Velthar through the long weeks that followed. Sometimes he would catch himself humming fragments of the melody, trying to recapture the strange sense of connection he had felt in that moonlit clearing. But the notes always slipped away from him, leaving only a profound sense of loss. His isolation deepened as the cycle progressed toward the time when he would face his second Rite. The elders had indeed selected more dangerous prey this time, capturing a young Thrak warrior from one of the neighboring systems. Unlike the human, this creature was armed and trained for combat, considered a worthy opponent for a hunter seeking to prove their worth. Velthar should have been preparing with increased intensity, hunting his skills for the greater challenge ahead. Instead, he found himself paralyzed by the same questions that had plagued him since that night in the hunting ground. What gave him the right to take this Thrak warrior's life? What made Kethvari survival more important than Thrak's survival? Was his personal honor really worth ending another being's existence? These were not the thoughts of a successful hunter. These were the doubts of a creature that had lost its way, forgotten its place in the natural order of things. As the night of his second Rite approached, Velthar realized with growing certainty that he was going to fail again. Not because he lacked the skill or strength to defeat the Thrak warrior, but because he no longer had the will to kill. The human had done something to him in those final moments before vanishing. Whether through song or gesture or simple dignity in the face of death, it had awakened something in Velthar that his people would consider a fatal weakness. Compassion, empathy, the ability to see other beings as more than just obstacles or resources. In Kethvari society, these were not virtues. They were diseases that needed to be cured before they spread to others. But as Velthar lay awake the night before his second chance at the Rite, he found himself hoping that the cure would never come. Whatever the human had given him, whatever change it had wrought in his heart and mind, felt more valuable than all the hunting honors his people could bestow, even if it cost him everything he had ever known. The second rite began at sunset, with Velthar once again standing in the sacred hunting ground. This time, however, the atmosphere was different. Word of his previous failure had spread throughout the settlement, and dozens of Kethvari had gathered to witness what many believed would be his final chance at redemption or his ultimate disgrace. The Thrak warrior they had brought for him was everything the human had not been. Tall, muscular, and armed with traditional bone weapons, the creature prowled the confines of the hunting ground with obvious combat experience. Its reptilian scales gleamed with natural armor, and its eyes held the cold intelligence of a professional killer. This was prey that would fight back, that would test every skill Velthar had learned in his years of training. This was what the Rite was supposed to be, a true test of a hunter's ability to claim victory over a worthy adversary. Velthar gripped his ceremonial blade and tried to summon the focus he would need for the battle ahead. But his mind kept drifting back to the human, to the inexplicable peace in its eyes and the haunting beauty of its song. How could he reconcile that memory with what he was being asked to do now? The Thrak noticed his distraction and used it to launch an immediate attack. The warrior moved with surprising speed for something so large, closing the distance between them in 3 quick strides and swinging a bone club toward Velthar's head. Instinct and training saved him. Velthar ducked under the swing and rolled away, coming up in a defensive crouch with his blade extended. The watching crowd murmured approval at the display of agility, but he could hear the underlying skepticism in their voices. The Thrak pressed its advantage, following up with a series of powerful strikes that forced Velthar to give ground. The bone club whistled through the air with enough force to shatter stone, and Velthar realized that a single solid hit would end the fight immediately. But as the battle continued, something strange began to happen. With each exchange, Velthar found himself studying his opponent not as prey to be defeated, but as a being with its own skills and motivations. The Thrak fought with the disciplined technique of a trained warrior, but underneath the surface, Velthar could sense something else. Fear. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. This creature, for all its size and strength and combat training, was just as afraid as the human had been. It was fighting for its life against an enemy it didn't understand, in a place far from home, with no hope of escape or rescue. The Thrak was someone's child, just as the human had been. Somewhere in the galaxy, there were people who cared about this warrior, who would grieve if it never returned home. Velthar's fighting stance wavered as the weight of this understanding crashed over him. The Thrak, sensing an opening, launched another attack. But instead of dodging or counterattacking, Velthar found himself stepping back and lowering his blade. "I yield," he said quietly. The words carried clearly across the hunting ground, followed by a moment of stunned silence. The Thrak warrior froze mid-swing, confused by this unexpected development. The watching crowd erupted in angry shouts and disbelieving curses. "What did you say?" Krethvar's voice cut through the chaos like a blade through flesh. Velthar looked up at his father, seeing the naked fury and shame burning in the old hunter's eyes. "I yield," he repeated louder this time. "I will not kill this being." The Thrak warrior slowly lowered its weapon, still watching Velthar with wary confusion. In its reptilian features, Velthar could see the same dignity he had witnessed in the human. A proud being facing death with courage, even though it didn't understand why it was being asked to die. Krethvar leaped down into the hunting ground, his own claws extended and his face twisted with rage. "You disgrace not only yourself but our entire bloodline," he snarled. "First you lose prey through incompetence, and now you surrender to it like some weak-minded herbivore." "I'm not surrendering," Velthar said, standing straighter as he faced his father's wrath. "I'm choosing not to kill unnecessarily." "Unnecessarily," Krethvar's voice rose to a roar. This is the rite of ascension. Killing is the entire point. Without this rite, you are not Kethvari. Then maybe I don't want to be Kethvari. The words hung in the air like a curse. The watching crowd fell completely silent, shocked by this ultimate blasphemy. Even the Thrak warrior seemed to sense the magnitude of what had just been said. Krethvar stared at his son in horror. "You don't know what you're saying," he whispered. "The shame, the madness of failure has twisted your mind. This can still be corrected. Take up your blade and finish what you started." But Velthar shook his head. "The human taught me something," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "It showed me that there can be honor in mercy, strength in compassion, that killing doesn't have to be the measure of worth." "The human?" Krethvar's expression shifted from fury to confusion. "What human? The prey escaped. You said so yourself." Velthar looked around at the crowd of his people, at their faces filled with anger and disappointment and incomprehension. Then he looked at the Thrak warrior, still standing ready to defend itself, but clearly puzzled by the turn of events. "I lied," he said simply. "The human didn't escape. I chose not to kill it, just as I'm choosing not to kill this warrior." The admission sent shock waves through the assembled Kethvari. Sekthan and the other elders exchanged glances of disbelief, while younger hunters began muttering about madness and contamination. "But where did it go?" Krethvar demanded. "We searched everywhere. There was no trace of the creature." Velthar was quiet for a long moment, remembering those final seconds in the hunting ground. The human placing his blade respectfully on the rock, then stepping back with that sad, understanding smile. The way it had simply faded, as if the choice not to kill it had somehow freed it from the need to be there at all. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think maybe. Maybe when you choose mercy over violence, when you see another being as more than just prey, something changes, something fundamental about how the universe works." Krethvar's claws scored deep gouges in the stone as his rage built to a crescendo. "Enough of this madness," he snarled. "If you will not complete the rite, then I will do it for you. The honor of our bloodline demands that this warrior die, even if my own son is too corrupted to deliver the killing blow." The old hunter turned toward the Thrak warrior, his own ceremonial blade gleaming with deadly intent. But before he could take more than a single step, Velthar moved between them. "No," the young Kethvari said firmly. "I won't let you kill in my name either." Father and son faced each other across the moonlit hunting ground, representatives of two completely different philosophies. Behind Krethvar, the watching elders and hunters tensed, ready to intervene if the confrontation turned violent. Behind Velthar, the Thrak warrior watched with intelligent eyes, beginning to understand that it had somehow become the center of a cultural revolution. "You would stand against your own father?" Krethvar asked, his voice now deadly quiet. "You would protect prey at the cost of your family's honor?" "I would protect another being's right to live," Velthar replied, "even if it costs me everything." For a moment, it seemed as if Krethvar might attack his own son. The old hunter's muscles bunched with barely restrained violence, and his breathing became rapid and harsh. But something in Velthar's eyes, a calm certainty that hadn't been there before, gave him pause. "You are no son of mine," Krethvar said finally, his words carrying the weight of formal disownment. "You are no longer Kethvari, you are nothing." The pain of those words hit Velthar harder than any physical blow could have. To be cast out from his people, to lose his family and identity and everything he had ever known, was a fate worse than death in Kethvari culture. But even as tears streamed down his spotted fur, he didn't step aside. "If being Kethvari means killing innocent beings for no reason other than tradition," he said through his tears, "then maybe being nothing is better." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by an unexpected development. The Thrak warrior, who had been watching the exchange with growing comprehension, suddenly stepped forward and placed one of its massive hands on Velthar's shoulder. When the young Kethvari looked up, the reptilian being's eyes held something that looked remarkably like respect. The Thrak spoke then, its voice a deep rumble that carried clearly across the hunting ground. Though the words were in its own language, the tone was unmistakable. It was offering protection, alliance, a place among its own people for someone who had shown such unprecedented courage. Velthar smiled through his tears, understanding that he wasn't losing just his Kethvari identity. He was gaining something far more valuable, the knowledge that compassion could cross species boundaries, that beings could choose to protect rather than destroy. Together, he and the Thrak warrior walked toward the passage that led out of the hunting ground. The crowd of Kethvari parted before them in shocked silence, unwilling to physically interfere, but unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. At the passage entrance, Velthar paused and looked back at his father one last time. Krethvar stood frozen in the center of the hunting ground, his face a mask of grief and rage and incomprehension. "I'm sorry," Velthar said softly. "I'm sorry I couldn't be what you wanted me to be, but I'm not sorry for choosing mercy over murder." With that, he turned and walked out of the hunting ground, leaving behind his name, his family, and his people. The Thrak warrior stayed beside him, a living symbol that strength didn't have to mean the ability to take life. Behind them, the assembled Kethvari remained in stunned silence, trying to process what they had witnessed. Some would dismiss it as madness, a tragic failure of a once promising hunter. Others would begin to question whether their ancient traditions really represented the only path to honor and strength. And deep in the crystal caves, where the elders kept their most sacred records, scribes would begin the long process of documenting the first voluntary failure of a rite of ascension in over 3,000 cycles. They would struggle to find words for what had happened, eventually settling on a simple phrase that would echo through Kethvari history. The young hunter chose mercy, and in doing so discovered a different kind of strength. Years later, when other species made contact with the Kethvari and began the delicate process of establishing diplomatic relations, they would find a people slowly beginning to question their most fundamental assumptions about predator and prey, strength and weakness, honor and shame. The change would be slow and difficult, opposed by traditionalists who saw any deviation from ancient ways as weakness and corruption. But the seeds of transformation had been planted on a moonlit night when a young hunter looked into the eyes of a human and saw not prey, but a person worthy of compassion. And though no one could prove it, some of the more philosophical Kethvari would come to believe that the human's mysterious disappearance that night had been the universe's way of rewarding mercy. That perhaps, when beings chose understanding over violence, reality itself shifted to support that choice. Velthar never returned to his people, but stories of his actions spread throughout the galaxy. He became a legend among those who believed that true strength lay not in the ability to destroy, but in the courage to protect. The human whose life he had spared was never identified, never found by the various space agencies that tried to track down the sole survivor of the crashed merchant vessel. But sometimes, on worlds where different species learned to live together in peace, travelers reported hearing a hauntingly beautiful song carried on the wind. A melody that spoke of home and hope, of connections that transcended the boundaries between different forms of life. And those who heard it always went away feeling somehow changed, as if they too had been touched by the same mysterious force that had transformed a young Kethvari hunter's understanding of what it meant to be truly strong.